This site here is the Ayers Green cuttings, and they were planted in September of 2007, and they were grazed for the first time in 2008 and then again in 2009. I was doing some collaborative research with John Paul Collins from the Department of Agriculture in Katanning, and we were condition scoring sheep and counting grazing days, and John Paul did a whole lot of other stuff, a lot of soil analysis and nutrition analysis and biomass production of both the saltbush and the understory, and we were comparing the Ayers Green sites to the direct seeded sites, and I guess that's been very helpful for me to know what to expect from grazing the saltbush, and that's, you know, we determined that plant density or stems per hectare and biomass production, I guess all of those things that hold true on other pastures also hold true on saltland pastures. And this year, with what I knew from grazing these in previous years, this autumn when I brought the sheep onto the site, I chose to start them off on the Ayers Green saltbush first because it is more palatable, and the sheep tend to learn to eat it more quickly. And of the Ayers Green, I started on the freshest site, where there was fairly good, I guess, annual pasture underneath the Ayers Green, so that the sheep weren't getting such a, you know, something to adjust on, I guess. And also the water trough in this paddock is central, so that bringing on quite a large amount of sheep onto a fairly small area, you know, hopefully the sheep stumble over the water trough often enough that they find a drink. So the idea was I was going to start on this site and then move on to the next site, adjacent paddock, which was direct seeded and probably the best of and the freshest of the direct seeded, and gradually work onto the paddocks that were more saline and had a higher proportion of saltbush as against the understory. And to do these sort of grazings and having such a large number of sheep, having ample supply of fresh water is very important. And so with some funding sourced from John Paul through the SGSL work, we've put in a production bore with a solar pump, and then I've reticulated the water from that bore and solar pump from 2 main storage tanks through all of the surrounding paddocks, and I have troughs that I move so that I'm just saving a little bit of cost there. And the bore gives us about 11,000 litres of water a day, and that's you know, that's with the storage tanks, that's ample for running the amount of sheep that we've had. With regard to stocking rates, I'm still learning myself, but we've run stocking rates of between 30 DSE up to 180 DSE. It all seems to work fairly well as long as you're attentive to making sure that the sheep are getting enough to eat and enough water. I guess being a perennial pasture type of system, you're aiming to graze it within a relatively short period of time, so that the plant gets, you know, once the plant starts to regrow and then you're grazing it again, I guess you're starting to damage your pasture. So I think a saltland pasture can probably tolerate grazing for about a month before I think you might start to do some harm to it. So I guess you can either look at your saltland pasture and equate the dry matter production and therefore how many sheep you might need to graze it with to get a month's grazing out of it, or just, you know, start with a number probably around 50 sheep to the hectare. We found that 30 sheep to the hectare was probably a little bit light because it just was taking a little bit too long for the sheep to get through the pasture. and 180 I guess is I think that becomes a bit stressful for the sheep, and certainly stressful for the farmer in the first instance, because your tolerance for things going wrong is less. But when I've gone to the high stocking rates, I've always been prepared to open the gate and let the sheep out into adjoining paddocks if things didn't seem to be working, and it seemed to work fairly well for me this year. So you know, next year I guess I'll be looking at just bringing a mob of sheep here, and whatever that mob size happens to be is what I'll be grazing. So I don't have any hard and fast rules with what I expect to graze, and I'm still learning. But I guess the same principles apply to grazing any other pasture when it comes time to moving the sheep on. Once the understory seem to have run out, and you know, the paddock seems to be bearing out a bit, well, that's as much of an indication as time to move on. And often I've found that the saltbush may not have all been grazed, and that's you know, that's something that I've learnt through doing the trial work and the body condition scoring, and when we were measuring the amount of pasture in the paddock and then trying to eat all of the pasture, that sometimes can compromise the condition of the sheep, because you're holding them on those paddocks so that you're eating all of your available pasture, but I think when you're doing your normal, you know, sheep grazing farmer type thing, or you're not trying to balance, or trying to get the full benefit of your pasture, you're trying to get the benefit for your sheep. And so when I thought that the sheep had pretty well grazed the pasture, if there was some saltbush left, I wasn't too stressed about that, and they just moved to the next paddock. And you know, because maintaining sheep on this sort of pasture is relatively easy, but you can lose condition score, and it's very hard to put it back on. So I think erring on the side of caution is probably the way to go.